Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 197, Illustrated Tudors, a conversation with Simon Sandys Winsch. For today's guest episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Simon Sandys Winsch, author of the Illustrated Tudor Dictionary. Given Simon's broad knowledge of the period, I took the opportunity to talk to him about some of the entries in the dictionary that give us a view of what life was like for the Elizabethans who went to the London theatres. We started by going back a few years into the reign of Henry VIII and discussed actions of his, the legacy of which the Elizabethans were still living with, and these led into conversations about some of the struggles of the ordinary Elizabethan life. Simon Sandys Winsch graduated from Aberystwyth University with a degree in History and International Politics, and then became a history teacher working in various schools. It was during that career that he realised the importance of knowing topics in depth, as well as the need to keep lessons as informative and interesting as possible, and he now puts those skills to use in writing history books. I spoke to Simon from his home over a Zoom call. I was really struck when I opened the encyclopedia for the first time, and apart from mentions of Alan William, a leading counter-reformationist, and the Battle of Antrim Moor, what we run into first is the battles of Henry VIII, his Anglo-French, and then leading on to the Elizabethan Anglo-Spanish wars. And it made me think of how much of the population of England, and particularly of London, how much they must have been aware of war going on, even though they didn't see it reported in quite the way that we do these days, of course. But it must have been a society governed by wars, even though the wars of Henry VIII had happened a few years in the past. They still were having influence, I think, on veterans being around. And these wars were really significant because of the way they depleted the treasury, something, of course, Elizabeth was struggling with throughout her reign.
It's one of those key things in the history of Parliament, because Henry VIII realised just how he needed Parliament, not just to legitimise his annulments, marriages, and change of religion as in head of the church, but he needed them for the taxation. And it was a huge burden. It did cause trouble. There was an outbreak of violence. I think it was in Suffolk, 1520s, when he tried to raise money. So even Henry VIII at sometimes had to back down in terms of taxation. But then when it came to Elizabeth, as you say, the Anglo-Spanish War, it was a huge drain because it was also in Ireland. The war in Ireland went on for, I think it was from about 1589 or 1585. So it dragged on right to the end of her reign, causing taxation. Obviously was a big hardship, but also you got lots of wounded soldiers coming back, unemployed, a lot of increase in domestic violence. You've got at the same time, you've got mass unemployment because of massive increase in population. I don't know how many people realise this, but the increase in population in Tudor times, it must have gone from it doubled in 100 years, roughly, from about 2 to 4 million. So, food production couldn't keep up, so prices shot up, salaries or labour wages went down, and so there was a lot of unemployment and there was a lot of food scarcity in Elizabeth's reign. So it was, especially towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, so the 80s and 90s, it was a period of great hardship amongst the general populace.
Yes, it's easy to think of the Elizabethan period for some as a great period of expansion, of course, and it was in many ways. But I think that idea that actually these people who are in London and going to the theatre, they probably needed a release of some sort because there wasn't too much enjoyment in their lives.
No, the occasional public execution was quite fun. Bring the family, and a picnic. Also, great fun to see some bear baiting in the animal pits in the south of the river. Cockfighting, So you're right. It wasn't much of an outlet for enjoyment. And Puritans at the time, who were quite vocal, they wanted to close down the animal pits on Sundays, which caused a huge uproar. And I think one of these pits collapsed, killing quite a few of the spectators. And the Puritans they didn't exactly jump up and down with joy, but they saw it as a sign from God, of course.
Of course.
It should not be done at all on Sundays. But yes, it was very difficult, and it was a violent time. Street violence was pretty common.
Yes.
I remember reading when I was reading about Henry Howard. Henry Howard, the poet and son of the third Duke of Norfolk, I think. He got arrested once for going around London smashing people's windows. And he was quite a well-known person. So, yeah, violence was common at the same time. I think people were just, well, it didn't help that people could own swords and knives, quite no problem.
Yes, it's easy. I mean, I've told some of the stories on the podcast myself about things like the death of Marlowe or the way Ben Jonson was involved in violent actions. So it does seem that it's no surprise that sword fighting turns up on stage quite often, not least in plays like Hamlet, where just about everybody ends up dead at the end, and amongst students as well. Fencing was, I think, part of the culture of sporting. Perhaps we'll get to talk about sport in a little while.
Romeo and Juliet, for instance, most people see it as a love story, but I think it's just as much a story of street brawling and fighting violence as it is a love story. And I think Shakespeare, I mean, I'm not an expert on theatre, but I think Shakespeare, he wrote plays that people would recognise in their everyday lives. And so they saw violence on an everyday scale, a daily scale almost. And I think, ironically, I read it, Romeo and Juliet was first performed at the Curtain Theatre. I might be wrong. And it was outside of that theatre in 1584. There was a massive riot, huge brawl between, I think it was largely apprentices. It was usually the apprentices who got into trouble.
Yes, they did cause a lot of trouble, the apprentices. They didn't have much time off, but when they did, they certainly went out and enjoyed themselves, in inverted commas.
Yes, it's like May Day. May Day was, the authorities got very nervous on May Day. I think there was a dreadful evil May Day. I think it was back in 1517, where the apprentices just went mad and just destroyed property belonging to foreigners, beat up foreigners, and unfortunately no one was killed. But you're right, the apprentices were a very dangerous bunch of people.
It was interesting. I've been reading the travel journal of Thomas Platter, who was the Swiss tourist who commented on Julius Caesar being performed in the Globe. And it is notable that as he travels up from the coast to London, most of what he talks about is the readiness of ships to go out to war, of cannon piled up on the side of the docks, ready to be loaded up. So this is clearly a country, at least the southern end of the country, that is prepared to fight when they have to. Although, as we just mentioned, of course, Elizabeth was reluctant to because of the financial situation that she was in. And her Anglo-Spanish War was a particularly controversial one, which is wonderfully summarised in your encyclopedia, I have to say, for a nice quick read of what it was all about.
Yes, it was a war she didn't want to go into. She was generally quite a cautious person. William Cecil, her chief minister, he too was generally a cautious person. It was a war they sort of couldn't avoid, I think, when it seemed clear that Spain would invade the Netherlands and England was the next target. I think even Elizabeth and Cecil realised that they had to do something. And just raiding Spanish treasure ships was probably not going to cut it. And of course, when, war was popular with the masses, a way of getting glory. And people like Philip Sidney, he was seen as this hero, again, in the war, who they idolised, didn't they? Probably mythologized him. But there's a few anecdotes about him, aren't there? Like giving his armour away and refusing water. But so I think it was a war that couldn't be avoided, but awful expense, awful cost on top of what was already going on in England. Quite unfortunate, really. One more thing about that war was that what a lot of people don't realise is just, obviously we know about the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but there was an English Armada the following year, which was even more disastrous. Elizabeth swore never to send another kind of expedition again. It was just, they lost so many ships and men. So yes, people don't hear about that so much in the history books.
Yes, that really isn't a familiar story, is it? The fact that England then sent out an armada to worry the Spanish. Yes, as you say here, England sent a counter armada of its own in 1589. Its aims were to destroy the Spanish Atlantic fleet, capture its treasure ships, and stir up rebellion in Portugal and establish a base in the Azores. But it failed at a huge cost, and Elizabeth refused to countenance such an ambitiously offensive campaign again. So England really were on the back foot here, isolated as a Protestant nation, and hence why they wanted to be in the Netherlands as badly as they were. And that, of course, crosses over with a bit of theatre history, because Christopher Marlowe is thought to have been out there spying in the Netherlands at the time. I think, again, I was struck, although we think of Elizabethan period as a great time of English expansion and success, actually a time of being very isolated in the world and being seen as the junior partner in the European powers.
It was very much a junior partner. I mean, the simple reason behind this is numbers. You look at the population of England was just a fraction of that of France or the Empire or Spain, Portugal. It just simply didn't have the resources, money, men, equipment that it could not compete with countries like France and Spain. Yeah, and I think a lot of the sort of thing about Elizabethan age being a golden one, a lot of it came from propaganda, didn't it? I think I would say, the Gloriana and all the wonderful playwrights like Marlowe and Shakespeare, the great, heroics of Drake, for instance, and Frobisher. I think it was all, what's the word? It was like a facade of what was underneath. And she built up this image quite happily, didn't she? Mm-hmm. With her portraits, poetry, and having an aura of mystery she built around her. So yes, it was a facade. I think she also had a lot of luck, Elizabeth. I think I might have mentioned this somewhere. She was very lucky because France, number one enemy usually, was enduring a series of civil wars. I think the French King Henry II, I think in 1560, soon after she became queen, he had a jousting accident, died, and I think that sparked off a series of civil wars in France. So that was France knocked out. Then you had Spain tied down in the Netherlands and often in Italy, fighting the French. So that was Spain, very much tied down. So Elizabeth, first, well, if you discount Edward VI, first Protestant monarch, she could have had a far, far worse time. But, she got lucky. She had the propaganda. And she had some very, very able people around her. I'm talking about Cecil and Walsingham, Drake, all these people. Plus, you got the literature, the flowering of this literature and plays and the arts. Amazing time of buildings, for instance, architecture. I went to Hardwick Halls a few months ago. That was like sort of the apogee of a Renaissance architecture. So you've got all these things going on at the same time, combining, isn't it, with the Renaissance that have covered up the rather unpleasant underbelly that you don't see.
Yeah, let's maybe talk a bit about that underbelly, because I am interested also in the people who were going to the theatre, and those were the common people of London who paid their penny to go and stand in the Globe or the Rose. And I was interested to read your article in the book on the poor laws, because obviously that's probably a subject quite close to an actor's heart. Players have never been at the top of society, and I suspect many of those, not those who were in some of the well-known troupes, but others who were going around the country, were probably always on the edge of being subject to the various laws. And there were, you've already mentioned some of the reasons why there was enormous poverty in the country at the time, a combination of various events, wars, but also the change in population and the ability for the country to keep up with feeding people. Because, of course, we were a country that needed to be self-sufficient in feeding themselves.
Well, that's true, yes. It was terrible. I mean, you also had other things like the dissolution of the monasteries, for instance. That those monasteries had been the only source of employment for a lot of people, or alms relief. They were gone. On top of that, you had the enclosures, which we had the enclosure rebellion in 1549, but enclosures continued. And this sent a lot of people into starvation and poverty because people were basically kicked off their land. More money, more land was being put towards sheep rather than wheat, because sheep producing wool, wool was England's main export. So a lot of landowners were now rearing sheep rather than growing wheat. So that created a bread shortage. So prices of bread went up.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you've got the debasement of the 1540s, 50s, which I don't know how much you realize, but people didn't trust the currency anymore because Henry just basically, he took out the silver content of the coin, or reduced the silver content of it, and it devalued the currency, so that caused prices to go up. So instead of saying, I want 1 groat for that price of bread, I want 2 now. So, putting it simply. So there's lots of reasons why it all came together badly in Elizabethan times for the ordinary folk.
Mm. I think I'm right in saying this is the first time that inflation really became a thing that people were aware of.
Yes, it was. It had such a terrible effect on people's wages. So in effect, basically, between 1500 and 1600, taking inflation into account, people's wages halved.
Grim.
Very grim. And they reckon at one point in Elizabeth's time, 1/3 of the population was in poverty. 1/3 of the population in poverty, and 10% were itinerant, just going around looking for work. It was, I can't compare it with other periods in history. It's partly sometimes we haven't got the information. And the other reason is I don't simply know, but I can imagine it being one of the, I might be shot down for this, but one of the grimmest periods for ordinary people in English history. Obviously, there are times like the Black Death, which was pretty bad as well. But I'm talking about purely in terms of amount of people, or the proportion of people in poverty. So yeah, not a good picture.
And perhaps this is why we end up with really only having records of theatrical activity from London, because I imagine that London was the place where people were still in work and therefore able to spend some money on an entertainment, whereas out in the country there must have been a much greater degree of poverty, as we probably still find in other periods of history as well.
Well, right. I mean, London, it literally, well, almost literally, it just consumed its people. If it wasn't for the immigration into the city, it would have just ceased to function. Because, as you know, London suffered awfully from diseases, plague, sweating sickness, smallpox, all these things. I think it was, it might have been pneumonia outbreak in 1557, been described as the most serious medical crisis in early modern England. Huge numbers wiped out. So what happened, London should have ceased to exist, because most of these mortalities were in London, where the people were crammed together. But people kept coming into London from the countryside because there was no work. They're looking for work. So it was purely immigration that kept London alive. And then, of course, these people came in, and slums appeared. The slums appeared around to the north and south and east. Well, I read recently the West End, the wealthier people built there, so building up between the city and Westminster, because smoke from the factories was blown from the west to the east. They wanted to be upwind of the foul chimney smoke.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because it does. Then now we sound like we're painting a really grim picture, but I don't know that it's a false one, because actually there was much to be grim about. But this also I'm sure explains why there were quite so many laws around poverty and the way people moved around the country that the Elizabethans created. Well,
yes, because the idea of masses of people moving around the country was anathema to the authorities. They believed everyone should stick to their place in society. Servants should stay with their masters, for instance. Women should stay with their men. So the idea of people just marauding around the countryside looking for work, it caused a lot of worry for the authorities. That's why they came up with these poor laws and made a distinction between deserving poor and undeserving poor. So deserving poor, you can imagine that these were people who were handicapped or had some illness, or just weren't able to work. And so they set up a system of poor relief,
Mm.
which became enacted. It all came tied together in 1601 at the end of Elizabeth's reign, which basically cared for the deserving poor by ordering parishes to raise money to look after these people. And often it was in the form of workhouses, and local people had to pay a bit of money to provide materials like hemp, stone for these poor people to work with and try and raise some money for themselves and learn skills. And that sounds all very good, actually. And I think it was. For those days, I think the Poor Law in 1601 was actually quite advanced and quite liberal for those days. Previously, they used more of a stick approach than carrot, and they had whipped vagabonds through the streets. Well, they still did that, of course, to the undeserving poor. It can't be the good spectacle of someone being whipped through the streets.
Yes, they did that. Maybe this brings us on to something else I wanted to talk about, which was crime and punishment, because, again, it's something you cover in some detail in the book. And this idea that punishment is a display of punishment as much as anything else. And I was interested to read, and probably something I should have thought of before, but that prisons existed, but they weren't there to incarcerate people long term as a punishment. They were really there to hold them before they were punished.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there were 18 prisons around London, each serving a general purpose. So, for instance, those who'd been convicted by the Star Chamber would go to the Fleet prison. Debtors and felons went to the Newgate prison. Ludgate, the people who were bankrupt. I mean, that was generally the case. So, yes, they were holding places, and the conditions, as you can imagine, were pretty grim. I think it was Father Gerard in Elizabeth's reign who was imprisoned in one of these cells with a load of other Catholics. He was a Catholic priest who had come over, a priest who'd come over to England. He'd got caught. And he said he delighted in the prison because it felt like one huge Catholic mass he could perform, a great Catholic congregation. And of course, if you were wealthy, you could pay for better accommodation. I think Walter Raleigh, for instance, he had 2 apartments in the Tower of London. And even his wife would live with him. And I think they conceived their child there.
I think that's right, isn't it? Yes.
Incredible.
That's a thought.
But otherwise, people had to rely on relatives to provide food for them.
And the crimes for which you could get punished were what we would think of as pretty slight ones these days. And I guess most people know this, that, just for begging or for stealing the smallest of items. I mean, you could be hanged, as you report here, you could be hanged for stealing an item to the value of 5p. Now, obviously, that's a bit more than it sounds like us to today.
Yes.
I'm not quite sure what 5p translates to in modern money, but still not that much.
No, I would guess it's something around £200, but I might be way out there. And it's particularly interesting, you could be punished for suicide as well.
Yeah, because of its religious connotation there, I guess.
Yeah, so a wooden stake was driven through your heart and you were buried in unconsecrated ground, so the middle of a field, for instance.
Yes, again, I was aware of the unconsecrated ground part of that, but not the driving the stake through a suicide's heart.
No, well, yeah, it sounds a bit like a vampire.
Yeah.
And witches as well. I mean, it's interesting actually, because I've written the Stuart Dictionary, and there's a lot of more interest in the witchcraft. It's a bigger thing in 17th century witchcraft.
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah.
But in the 16th century, witches in England were generally, until the 1560s, Elizabeth's reign, witches were seen as generally a good thing. They were healing. These were old women who had considered to have healing powers, and they were good witches, and they were allowed to live in their communities. It was I think there was a law in 1562 against witches, and it was from that point on they started to be persecuted. I mean, whether we can call them witches or not, these are what people perceive to be witches. But England was, it eventually caught up with the rest of the continent in a terrible way, in the way it dealt with witches. Witches were burned long before they were in England, on the continent. But I do like some of the punishments, like the drunkard's cloak.
Oh yes, because you have
the drunkard's cloak.
You have an illustration of that in the book, which I'd never seen before.
I think that could be popular on a stag do these days.
You'd better describe it, for the listener.
Well, it's someone who's been drinking too much could be liable to be put inside a giant barrel with his head sticking out of the top and his arms sticking out the sides, wandering around. I mean, I don't imagine he could get through any doorway wearing this. He'd just have to wander around, and people would just mock him, I imagine. Give him plenty of time to sober up too. Then you've also got the Branks bridle, which, I mean, it's obviously terribly sexist, but this is for any wife who was scolding her husband, basically, or gossiping, would have this terrible iron, I don't know how to describe it really, an iron piece stuck into her mouth, and it was attached around the back of her head, so she couldn't remove it. And it was really uncomfortable. It would cause her to salivate, basically, and it caused a lot of pain in the mouth. And she'd be led on a leash wearing this around the streets. A lot of the punishments in those days were designed just to humiliate. But the more serious crimes of punishments were as a deterrence. So the hanging, drawing, and quartering, your burnings, this was more a deterrence. How much it worked? You could say it just that violence bred violence. I
mean, I don't want to put anybody off their tea, but the hanging, drawing, and quartering is the most brutal thing. Hanging someone and then pulling them down just before they're dead anyway and dismembering them.
Awful.
Is just, well, how did anyone ever think that up, let alone actually do it to another human being?
Yeah, I mean, there were some sort of stories around these executions as well. So I think, for instance, a condemned man, if he kissed your child on the head, that would bring your child lots of good luck. If the rope snapped before you died, you were considered let off by God. So that didn't always help. And some merciful executioners would pull on the rope, or they would allow relatives to pull down on the rope to speed up the death.
So actually, of course, what we in popular culture, what we see most is the beheading, because that was reserved for the nobility.
Yeah.
But actually, that was, in some respects, a bit of a blessing, presumably, because you didn't have to go through the torment of being hung or drawn and quartered.
Well, they did a good job of it. I think Cromwell, I think they had 3 goes of the axe on his neck. And there were a few other people. But certainly in the following century, you had the terrible Jack Ketch. I don't know if you've heard of Jack Ketch. He was an official executioner who, and during one person paid him to do a good job. After 3 blows of the axe, he turned his head around and said, "What did I pay you for?" You had some really amateurish executioners. Oh, that reminds me of the story of the Earl of Essex, when after Essex's rebellion, and he being a lord, he was beheaded. But the great irony here, I think it was about 10 years previously, Essex led a raid on Cadiz. There were strict instructions not to attack the population of Cadiz and the town. Quite a few of these soldiers did, though, and he ordered them to be hanged from the main yard of the ships. But no one came forward. No one offered to do the job. No one offered to be the executioner. But one man he did allow. Oh, no, now I forget his name. It'll come to me. But he said, "Okay, I'll let you live if you hang these people, and as long as you become also the state executioner." And guess who it was who executed Essex 10 years later? The very man he had reprieved.
Yeah, perhaps Essex deserved that. Discuss.
Well, they say he was the last attempt of nobility to control the monarchy.
Yes, again, another man that plays his part in theatre history with the attempt to use Richard II to prompt thoughts about his rebellion.
Yes.
Let's move on to some more cheery stuff if we can find something, because there are things
more
to find. What about sport and leisure? Because the theatre wasn't the only thing that people did to entertain themselves, and you have a nice section on sport and leisure in the book. Although, again, the entertainments aren't maybe what we would think of as entertainment so much.
Oh, my days.
Bear baiting and cockfighting.
Yeah. I mean, it very much split the classes as well. So there were certain entertainments that were reserved just for the nobility. It was very important. It was very, very much, obviously, a class-based society, and there were sumptuary laws that that said you could not do a certain thing or wear certain clothes or even have a certain number of courses at meal times.
Yes, now that was something that I'd missed before about the sumptuary laws, which I knew about the clothing laws and how actors get exempted from them. But
Yes.
but yeah, that even restricted what you were allowed, how many courses you were allowed to eat in your meal, given your social status.
That's right. So a knight, for instance, I don't know the exact figures. He might be allowed, say, 5 courses, but a bishop would be allowed, say, 7. Yeah, and obviously you can't tell how many people obeyed these rules. But yes, it was very much a class-based society. So, for instance, going back to sport and leisure, only the nobility would do jousting, for instance, or play real tennis, which, of course, Henry VIII was supposed to be one of the best in the country at.
And hunting was reserved for the upper classes as well.
Yes, hunting as well. Whereas the lower classes would go to the bear baiting and the football.
Yes, that's a very early start for football, isn't it? I don't think I realised it went quite that far back. Still the most popular sport in the country, it is said.
Yeah, no, it was incredibly popular. I mean, we probably wouldn't recognise it as football. We'd probably recognise it as a brawl. And in fact, if you go to Ashbourne every Shrove Tuesday, they do. I don't know if you realise, they do this Tudor football still. And all the shops batten up their windows, put the hatches down, because... but the pubs do a roaring trade. But yes, it was pretty brutal. I think Henry VIII and several monarchs, actually other monarchs, tried to ban football and wanted them to practice archery instead. For obvious.
So, as you mentioned here, it was played as a game between 2 villages with no limit on the number of participants. And there was no ban on, and I quote from you, punching, biting, spitting and kicking.
That's right. You weren't allowed to kill anyone deliberately. So there were, it was quite...
But it had more fatalities than any other sport.
Yeah. Perhaps it ought to replace Premiership football these days. That'd be a bit more interesting.
It could be a bit more exciting on a wet Saturday, couldn't it?
Yeah. And then gambling. I mean, a lot of games were made interesting through gambling, in the taverns as well. So this was one kind of activity that all classes enjoyed. In the taverns, there'd be lots of gaming boards, for instance, where they'd play things like backgammon, fox and geese, and the monarchy as well. So Elizabeth, she loved playing cards and apparently was a terrible cheat. She always cheated. But did anyone accuse her of it? No, yes. Cards and gambling and with dice as well. And the theatre, of course. Incredibly popular.
Yeah, this is the period of the first mass entertainment theatre, and the time when theatre was the mass entertainment of its day, in a way that we would say, I suppose, television is now, that most people could get access to it if they wanted to, because plays were performed almost every day of the week, and they changed so regularly that you could go and see a different play as often as you liked, or you could go and see the same one again when it came round in the cycle. A penny to go and stand, 2pence for a seat, and upwards from there, for that very limited sort of 30-40 year period before it went indoors, and then it gets a bit more expensive. We just do one more to round off. Will Somer's an interesting character because he's an early court jester, but he has a great influence on the clowns that find their way into Elizabethan theatre through the likes of Will Kemp and into Robert Armin as well. I'm interested in him more for his influence than the fact that he turns up in theatre history that much.
Will Somer, very interesting character. He's supposed to be, they reckon he is, in that famous portrait of Henry VIII with his family. The impossible portrait, I call it, because it shows Jane Seymour and Prince Edward as a 6-7-year-old. But yeah, that wasn't possible because she died, didn't she? A few days after he was born. And then in one archway, there's a picture of Will Somer. I believe he has a monkey on his neck, on his shoulder. Yeah, and they say that they reckon he was a natural fool rather than a professional jester. In other words, he probably did have a mental disability. And the interesting thing is that such fools like these, the natural fools, people believed that they were closer to God than anyone else because they always told the truth. They were always honest in front of anyone, the king even. And so this honesty people associated with God, I guess for obvious reasons. And Will Somer managed to get away with saying lots of things to Henry, and even called him names like, he called him Harry or Hal or Uncle. And they had a very close bond, these two. Although Will Somer did overstep the mark once. He called Anne Boleyn, when they were married, he called Anne Boleyn a whore. And Henry VIII almost killed him there and then. He had to flee the court for a few days, but then Henry let him back later. But a lot of advisors, nobles, would sometimes use Will Somer to get negative news to the king, or news that their fear might get king angry. They'd get it through Will Somer. Please tell the king this, you know. So he was quite an important conduit of information for the king. So he was an important man. I mean, he didn't decide policy or anything, but he was, fortunately, probably, he was a very important man to Henry. He did provide him with some entertainment and light relief, especially in the later years when he was in pain. And he later became Queen Mary's fool, because in Henry's will, I think it said that he asked his successors to look after him. And apparently Will Somer was married to another fool called Jane Fool, who is at the other end of that picture I was talking about earlier. There's a woman in the other archway who people think is probably Jane Fool, although we don't know if they actually married each other. It's impossible to say. There were various other fools which could be, you know, given as gifts to people, or they were just or passed down to people, like Will Somer was. Yeah. It's terrible, isn't it? But at least, you know, these fools. I mean, you can imagine what care for mentally ill people was like in those days. You could call these fools the lucky ones, I suppose.
As I said, there is this line where we can trace them through to the performers who took on the role of fools. And of course, Shakespeare and other plays include fools in them, and they are the people who often speak truth to power to kings. So that wasn't an untrue version of the fool. That is actually what they did sometimes in real life. And at the very end, we think there's a reference to Will Somer in Henry VIII, the Henry VIII play by Shakespeare, which is kind of an apology for someone not being present in the play about Henry VIII, but that's also possibly because Shakespeare's clown of the time also wasn't able, he was ill, we think, and wasn't able to be in the play. So an interesting little connection that goes from Henry VIII right through to the reign of James I in the art that's being produced there. My thanks to Simon for taking the time to talk to us. After we finished recording, we considered if we'd been a little too down on the struggles of the Elizabethan period for ordinary people. But although people certainly must have found some joy and happiness in their lives, there seems little doubt that life was hard, even if you stayed on the right side of the law. Those 2 hours of release in the playhouse, where the daily troubles could be forgotten briefly, must have been very special moments for many. The Illustrated Tudor Dictionary, which covers very much more than we could discuss in the podcast, is published by Pen and Sword Books and is available from all good bookshops. I've put links to the online stores in the show notes. The word illustrated there is very important, as the book is full of some wonderful reproductions and illustrations which really help to bring the entries to life. I found it a very useful book for a bit of background on some of the people and events who interacted with the Elizabethan theatre, and I think anyone with an interest in this period of history, however passing or detailed that might be, would find this book just as interesting and useful as I have done. And the good news is that, as he mentioned, Simon is already working on a companion volume covering the Stuart years. I look forward to seeing that in due course. Next time, it's back to the theatre and more Ben Jonson as we look at his next play, and one that continued the War of the Poets, The Poetasta. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the cost of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation for selected episodes. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.